Samantha leaned her head against my shoulder, and a flicker of discomfort shot through me. It was there and gone in an instant. Anyone else would have missed it. Not Samantha. "What's wrong?" "Nothing," I said, looking at the ground. I could feel her gaze searching my face for the truth. Then I heard her suck in a breath as she stepped back. "You met someone." I looked up to find her wearing a big, dopey grin. "It's nothing. It's nothing," I said, shaking my head. "Right." I plunged my hands into the pockets of my jacket and looked away from her, then back again. She just stood there wearing that ridiculous grin. "I've got a client for you." "Samantha, are we really going to do this again? It didn't work out last time." "It'll be fine if you behave yourself, for once." "Samantha..." "Ryan, it won't kill you to talk to the woman." What rock did this one crawl out from under? "Ryan, please. You'd be doing me a favor." The vulnerability and earnestness in her voice worried me. Samantha was not one to paint herself into a corner. If she decides to stop for coffee, she has a backup plan. But this was the voice of a woman out of options. My mind raced through the people who could possibly have leverage on her. It was a short list. There was only one way to find out what was going on. "The earliest I can get there is this afternoon." "That'll be fine." We hung up, and a minute later I received a text with an address and a list of things she wanted me to bring. It took me longer than expected to round up everything I needed before meeting Samantha. It was early evening when I finally arrived at the 2-story home in Crown Heights, with a bag of camera equipment slung over my shoulder. Samantha looked profoundly relieved when she answered the door. She slipped her hand around my neck and gave me a peck on the lips. "Thank you for coming." "You realize I have no idea what I'm doing, right? I'm a photographer, not a filmmaker." "We aren't shooting Citizen Kane. It'll be fine. Come in." She stepped back, ushered me into the house, and took my coat. In the living room was a frail woman leaning tenuously on an aluminum cane with 4 rubber feet at the bottom. "Ryan, this is my grandmother, Edith." The woman sagged into a chair next to the window. "Bubby, this is the friend I was telling you about." Edith looked at me as though she were inspecting a cut of meat. Before I could say hello, she waved her hand dismissively at me. "Bubby, he's here to record your video for the Shoah Foundation." Edith looked back and forth between Samantha and I several times. She gave another resigned wave of her hand and looked out the window. We set up the tripod, camera, and lights, and Samantha did her best to make it look like she was assisting me and not the other way around. Then I pressed record on the camera, and Samantha sat down across from Edith. "Bubby, tell me the story." Edith looked at Samantha with the expression one shows a child asking to hear the same bedtime story over and over. Edith took a deep breath and glanced at the hallway as if she were plotting her escape. "Bubby," Samantha said, her eyes pleading with the old woman. "I was born in Lodz on September 23rd, 1931. 2 minutes later, my sister Devora was born. It was always that way for us. Wherever I went, she was right behind me. When I play in the street or do chores, always she is there. A child never thinks such things will change. Back there and back then, if you were old enough to stand, you were old enough to work. Devora and I would help my mother all day long, washing, cleaning, cooking. But in the evenings, we did what we wanted. A neighbor taught me how to carve wood, and I would make little things out of scraps I found in the street. Devora would draw with charcoal she saved from the fire. So you were both artists? Edith gave a dismissive wave of her hand. I made little toys and candlesticks. Devora was an artist. Her drawings were beautiful. You would not believe they came from a child's hand. When we were 8 years old, the Nazis came. They penned up all the Jews in the ghetto, and when starvation didn't kill us fast enough, they started shooting people in the streets and sending them to the camps. Because we were twins, people always noticed Devora and I. Being noticed by the Nazis was dangerous. My mother was terrified for us and sent Devora to stay with a family on the opposite side of the ghetto. She wouldn't tell me who they were, this family. She was afraid I'd go looking for Devora. Of course I would. She was my sister. In the end, it didn't matter. Eventually, they sent all the Jews in lots to Auschwitz. When the war ended, we searched for Devora, but so few from lots survived, and those who did fled as fast as they could. So we left. More than a year, I lived with only the things I could carry in a sack. Finally, we settled in America. We had a small apartment on Grand Concourse Boulevard. It was a good life, but I missed my sister. My mother always told me Devora was with a good family. They would take care of her. She didn't want me to worry. She would take me to museums, hoping the sculptures would make me want to start carving again. She wanted me to be happy, but it only reminded me of Devora. Then one day, my mother and I were at the Metropolitan Museum, and I had a thought. Devora was an artist. Maybe her new family would bring her to the museums too, and I'd find her there one day. The silly wish of a child, but to this day, when I'm in a museum or a gallery, I look for her. Edith turned to look out the window again. After giving her a moment to compose herself, Samantha asked Edith questions about her time in lots before the war. As I listened, I looked around the room. Edith had a strange eye for decor. There was a huge cabinet with dozens of wood carvings and ceramics, which I assumed were Edith's work. They were amazingly detailed. Catty-corner to the cabinet was a large plush sofa encased in plastic slipcovers. On each side of the sofa, there was a set of 3 vintage suitcases stacked up to act like end tables. They were elegant leather bags with brass latches polished to a mirror finish. The most striking thing was a picture of Edith on the wall. It was from the late 50s or early 60s. She was standing on a train platform dressed in a skirt suit and a pillbox hat. A suitcase sat on the platform next to her. She was a gorgeous woman with a radiant smile. At first glance, I could have mistaken her for Samantha. 3 hours later, the camera gear was packed and I went to the closet to get my coat. It was hanging in a sliver of space toward the left of the closet. The rest of the space was taken up by suitcases. Most of them looked like they hadn't seen the light of day for at least a decade. On top was a 1950s model from the photograph on the wall, blue with white rubber trim that had seen plenty of use. I put on my coat and lugged the camera equipment out onto the front stoop. Samantha came out a minute later and leaned against the railing. So? Strong woman. Very, but that wasn't what I was asking. She looked at me expectantly. What? Can you find her? Find who? Devora. Samantha, this is why people come to you, isn't it? This is different. Why? Your aunt was taken in by another family whose name you don't know. Since it's unlikely the immigration clerk they met at Ellis Island spoke Polish or was even sober, her name was probably changed again when she entered the country. And unless you think Devora is hanging out in a crack house somewhere in Brownsville, then it's fair to say this is much different than my usual jobs. We don't even know if she's in the country. She's in New York. And you know this how? I did as much research as I could. The family who took Devora in was named Dombrowski. There's a passenger manifest of a ship leaving Scotland in 1947, bound for New York. A Dombrowski family with a child named Devora was on it. The ship arrived in New York, but there was no record of anyone named Dombrowski aboard, so you're right. Their name probably was changed when they came through. But they would have settled here. They didn't know anyone else in the States. They would have no reason to go anywhere else. You could have told me all this over the phone. You wanted me to meet her, so I'd feel guilty if I refused. I'm Jewish. Guilt is my native language, she said through a forced smile that faded quickly. Neither of us said anything for a while. Samantha was right. It wasn't the most difficult job I'd ever taken. But I'd already disappointed her once with the marshal job. That was a minor inconvenience for her. If this ended badly... Money's no object. Buy me a steak dinner and we'll call it even. Samantha's mouth curved into a cautious smile. She started to say something, but I cut her off. I'm not promising anything. She nodded. Email me the research you've done. I'll take a look. She kissed me on the cheek and whispered a thank you in my ear. What's with the suitcases? She glanced at Edith through the window, then shrugged. I guess when you grow up with nothing, you cling to simple things. From the time she was able to support herself, she refused to go to bed hungry, and she didn't go anywhere unless she had a nice bag for her things. I spent most of the train ride back home thinking about Edith and Devora. I was so lost in my thoughts that I missed my stop. Emerging from the 165th Street station into the cold air helped to clear my head. New York City has a special kind of beauty that only shows itself on a clear, crisp night. I was still unfocused as I walked back downtown, and I didn't notice the black SUV pull around the corner just ahead of me. When I reached 162nd, Punio was leaning up against the side of a building looking at me. We gotta talk, Essay. Didn't I tell you to stay in the Bronx? I got plans, and you ain't part of them. What kind of plans? Not your business. He pulled a wad of cash from his pocket, bound with a rubber band, and tossed it to me. There's more where that came from if you stay out of my way. If not... He shrugged as if he hadn't decided how to kill me yet, but he was working on it. I tossed the money back to him. I'll take my chances. That's a bad decision, Essay. It's not my first, I said as I crossed the street and headed down to my apartment. After 3 days poring over Samantha's meticulous research, I was nowhere. I chased down every resource I could find on Holocaust survivors, Polish immigrants, even a couple of support groups for twins who had a sibling that died. All were dead ends. I had to find a different angle on this thing. I decided to meet up with a friend. I arrived at Union Square a little after 1 p.m. I stood waiting just inside the entrance to the park. 10 minutes later, a wiry man in a full-length wool coat came up the path with something tucked under his arm. His dyed afro was drawn into small twists that made it look like his head was topped with auburn flames. He pulled the flat object from under his arm as he walked over to the retaining wall at the park's entrance. Crouching, he pressed it against the wall, leaning all of his weight against it, then stood and walked off into the park. Pulling my camera from my messenger bag, I walked over to where the object had been placed and knelt next to it. It was a small Jackson Pollock-style drip painting, black on a yellow background. Written along the border of the painting were the words, "This is not art." In the bottom right corner was the artist's signature, 5 letters in a U shape that spelled out "Charm." I quickly shot the painting from as many angles as possible, then retreated to my previous position and photographed the people who examined it as they walked by. About 30 minutes later, a park employee pushing a broom and a garbage can passed by as he came out of the park. He would have missed the painting entirely if he hadn't put up his foot on the wall to tie his shoe. I got a picture of him pulling it off the wall and tossing it into the can before he moved on. Charm was sitting on a bench at the opposite end of the park when I found him. I sat down next to him. I scrolled through the pictures I'd taken on the viewfinder of my camera. "What do you think?" "I like it." "I didn't ask you if you liked it. I asked you what you think." This was our ritual when I photographed Charm's work. He drops his art, then he has to leave or risks being arrested, so I'm the record of his work. I shoot it, then meet up with him, at which time he asks me the same really annoying question. What do I think? I think it looks cool, but I'm pretty sure that's not the answer he's looking for. "I think you don't like Jackson Pollock." "I love Pollock. The man was abused by his own genius. Fascinating." "Then why does it say this is not art?" "It's not art. It's a painting. The art happens here," he said, tapping his finger against his temple. "Appreciation, revulsion, arousal. You can't have art if all you have is paint and canvas. Art demands experience. Wouldn't that experience happen for more people if you put it where it wasn't removed so quickly?" I said as the photos transferred from my camera to my tablet. "Street art is ephemeral. Eventually, it all goes away. I embrace that. It's beautiful." "Uh-huh." I tilted the tablet toward him, showing him a picture of the painting on the wall. "If that's true, then why do you have me take pictures of your work?" "Because I'm a hypocrite," he said with a radiant smile. This is his standard line, and I don't believe it. Whatever drives an artist to create, at the end of the day, they love their art. To let something you love disappear without a trace is an unnatural act. I emailed the pictures to Charm, then posted my favorites to my photo blog. "You know anything about artists working in the 50s? "Sure. Amazing stuff during that time." "Any women?" "There are always women. They weren't recognized for anything back then other than raising families. But they still made art, textiles, crafts, amazing stuff. Some of the best work out there today can't touch them." I explained what I knew about Devora and why I was trying to find her. "Some powerful work came out of the Holocaust, but I can't think of anyone who might be your lady." He gave me names of some art dealers who might be able to help. Then I tucked everything back into my messenger bag and stood up. "Why don't you sit for a while and enjoy, my friend? It's a beautiful day." "It's freezing and I need coffee. Thanks for the info. See you around, Charm." I was halfway to Starbucks when my phone chimed. There was a text message from Dee Dee. "By this point, I should have received a flirty text at the very least." "Sorry. It's been a crazy couple of weeks." Which was a half-truth. It was crazy by most people's standards, fairly average for me. I'd nearly called her a few times, but something always came up. "Clearly you have a moment right now." "Yeah." "Wow, you really suck at this." "Disappointed?" "Actually, no. I find social awkwardness oddly attractive." "Well, then I'm your man." "See? That wasn't so hard, was it? Next you ask me if I want to meet for coffee." I already drink too much coffee. How about dinner? That's a big step. Are you sure you want to do that? Good point. Coffee it is, then. Only if the place serves a good espresso. Regular coffee doesn't have enough caffeine. Now who's flirting? Just trying to draw you out into the open. You aren't an easy man to find. My thumb hovered over the screen to type a response, but I kept reading the last text she sent. Draw you out into the open. Draw you out. My brain reflexively sifted through the pieces of information I had about Devora and fit them together. Devora was an artist who disappeared into New York City more than 70 years ago. Tracking her down through public records is impossible. I need to draw her out. I wheeled around, tucking the phone into my pocket, and headed back to the park. Fortunately, Charm was still sitting on the bench where I'd left him. Did you decide to relax and enjoy the day, Ryan? I need your help, Charm. I asked Samantha to get the blue suitcase from Edith's closet and drop it off at Charm's studio. She tried several excuses to get Edith to surrender it. Eventually, Samantha slipped it out while Edith was napping. Charm took twice as long as expected to finish, so I was expecting something really impressive. I was disappointed to see the suitcase in exactly the same condition when I found him standing near a park bench in Bowling Green. When he saw me, he placed the suitcase on a bench, popped the brass latches, and opened it, leaning the top against the backrest. The interior was covered completely in pennies. Charm walked over to where I was standing. I nodded with approval. Not really my style, but I like the way it came out. What do you think? It's perfect. Be sure to get me some pictures. Charm patted me on the shoulder and walked off. I continued to watch as people walked up to the suitcase. Some took photos, some chatted about it, and some just rolled their eyes. Word must have spread through social media. Within 45 minutes, underground art fans were showing up to see the suitcase. One woman stopped and asked me if the piece was made by Banksy. I'm glad Charm wasn't around to hear that, and I don't think Banksy would have been too happy with it either. I stood there scanning the crowd for another hour as the cold bit into my feet, draining the feeling from them. No luck. Then a man in his 40s crossed Whitehall Street, pushing a woman in a wheelchair. They entered the green and walked over to the suitcase. She was bundled up like an Arctic explorer, wearing wraparound sunglasses like you see on people who've had cataract surgery. She took them off to get a better look at the suitcase. I circled around them so I could see her face. I used my phone to snap a picture of her and sent it to Samantha. 5 minutes later, a town car stopped by the green and Samantha got out with her grandmother in tow. She led Edith into the park and they approached Devora. Samantha knelt down next to the wheelchair. I wasn't close enough to hear what they were saying. There was an awkward moment where Samantha backed away, and Edith and Devora looked at each other. Then Edith leaned over the wheelchair and put her arms around her sister. Samantha was standing beyond them, her gloved hands folded, pressed tightly to her lips, watching the reunion with tears in her eyes. After the two women had released each other, Samantha led them all back to the warmth of the car and then met me at the park gate. I don't think a steak dinner is going to cover this. Maybe 100 Nights of Sodom. Samantha leaned her head against my shoulder and a flicker of discomfort shot through me. It was there and gone in an instant. Anyone else would have missed it. Not Samantha. What's wrong? Nothing, I said, looking at the ground. I could feel her gaze searching my face for the truth. Then I heard her suck in a breath as she stepped back. You met someone. I looked up to find her wearing a big, dopey grin. It's nothing. During the Marshall job, It's nothing, I said, shaking my head. Right. I plunged my hands into the pockets of my jacket and looked away from her, then back again. She just stood there with that ridiculous grin on her face. Finally, she said, "Well, goddamn, this has been quite a day." "I'm not..." She leaned close and put her fingertips over my lips to quiet me. Then she pecked me on the cheek and took a step back, self-consciously straightening her coat. "I'm happy for you, sweetie. It's long overdue." There was the barest hint of disappointment in her voice. I opened my mouth to protest again, but she cut me off. "And if I know you, you haven't spoken to this woman in days. Call her. Tonight." Then she turned and walked back to the car, calling a goodbye to me over her shoulder. I made my way home with random bits of the last week jostling around my brain. It was so distracting that I struggled with the lock on my apartment door for 5 minutes before I realized I was using the wrong key. I dropped onto the couch and pulled my phone out to check the time. Scrolling through my texts, I found the abandoned conversation I had with Dee Dee from a few days ago. It conjured voices in my head. Dee Dee flirting with me, Samantha scolding me, Punyo threatening my life. Finally, I shook my head clear of all of them, and I typed, "Awake?" 30 seconds later came the response, "Maybe." I dialed Dee Dee's number. "Hi." "Hi."
If you've enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to rate the Red Shift Chronicles on iTunes. The Red Shift Chronicles is written and performed by Tom Simonson. The show is recorded by Steve Simonson at String Theory Studios. All music for the Red Shift Chronicles is written and performed by Steve Simonson.